And as our John Terrett just told us, in the U.S., shoppers are continuing their spending, with retail sales up in June for the third straight month. However, growth was a little less than had been expected or hoped for. Easing inflation and a strong labor market are both assisting there. Karina Mitchell has more details.
What the report shows is that consumers really are starting to slow down, and all of that pent-up pandemic demand has basically dried up. So the Commerce Department reported that advanced retail sales for the month of June edged up by just 0.2%. Now, the estimate was for a rise of 0.5%, so a little bit off from that. What it shows is that consumers are still spending, trying to go toe-to-toe with inflation, but there has been a big deceleration in spending, and that's despite inflationary pressures beginning to ease. Having said that, there were areas where consumers did dispense with their money in June. Some of those include home furniture, perhaps sprucing up their homes for the summer season. Electronics, we've seen sweltering heat and record heat waves across the country, so perhaps investing in some cooling units and fans to beat some of that oppressive heat. And clothing sales also edged up higher. But on the flip side, we saw gas sales drop by 1.4% month over month. Interesting, because you think of June as being a time when people start to travel, fill up their tanks and take a road trip, but that's not necessarily the case. In fact, year over year, gas sales have dropped by more than 22%. Now, also, we saw a pullback in personal care products, even though the prices of those products continue to go through the roof. Sports, hobbies, book sales also came in lower, and sales at department stores dropped by 2.4% month over month. So it shows that even despite a big drop in those gas sales, consumers are still being very conservative about where and how they spend their money. And we saw a very, very conservative shopper in the month of June that thought very carefully before dispensing with any of their money. And so basically, you know, the question is that investors were able to shrug off this soft report, but it actually turns out to be fairly good news for those worried about a Fed that stays aggressive after July, because this report really shows that the Fed's policy of trying to beat down inflation is actually working. It's taken long enough to take root, but it has taken root, and that could mean we see a less aggressive Fed. They meet next week, that's their next policy meeting, and then they take a break, but they have two more opportunities after that to hike rates. We expect them to do so in July, but could they pause based on the data that they've seen if they see a trend that continues with the report that we saw today? In that case, we could be coming very close to the end of the rate hiking cycle, which is great news for investors. And it's a push towards the direction of finding that Goldilocks soft landing scenario that so many more investors and analysts are actually starting to buy into. We will just have to wait to see if inflation cooperates, if it comes down, or if it stays sticky for longer. Karina Mitchell, CGTN, New York.
You know, in a related matter, they used to call it keeping up with the Joneses, but now Gen Z and millennials find they don't want to or don't have to. A survey by consumer technology platform Credit Karma is saying that they're dumping friends who lead them to overspend. That's as close to 90% of millennials, and 80% of Gen Z say they have a friend who drives them to spend money that they simply don't have, even leading them down the road to debt. And they're blaming dining out and clothing splurges, plus trips and self-care, like we just heard, and massages and manicures. Okay, for more on all this millennial and Gen Z spending, let's bring in Jason Goldberg. He is the Chief Commerce Strategy Officer. I hope I got this right. Publicis Groupe, is that correct, Jason?
That's perfectly fine. Publicis or Publicis?
Publicis, okay. Let's get right to it, because I'm one of these guys that has a couple of these Gen Zers running around, and I don't see overspending a problem with them. But what about with the younger generation? What are they looking at compared to someone my age as I was growing up? How different are things?
Yeah, well, you know, things certainly are different. The Gen Z, which is mostly what we're talking about, which is kind of 12 to 27-year-olds, you know, they grew up through the Great Recession. Now they've lived through COVID, where the vast majority saw, you know, at least one family member temporarily lose their job. And so they're actually economically insecure, which causes them to be more savers. So when they answer a survey and they say, like, we're worried about overspending, we're spending too much, the data doesn't show that they're actually spending more than cohorts. They're just more aware of what they're spending. They actually, at their age, are saving a bigger percentage of their income than millennials or Gen Xers did. So they're saving almost 30% of their income, which is by historical standards, awesome.
That kind of goes against the grain of a couple of things I've been hearing. One, that so many kids are saddled with large student loan debts, and secondly, you hear all the time that young people out of college a few years, maybe dipping into the millennials, just don't have the money to buy a new home or something like that.
Yeah.
So are younger generations thriftier? Do you think that it's going to be to their benefit in years to come?
Yeah, so they are thriftier, but part of the reason they're thriftier is because they're earning less. All of those things that happened to their cohort caused their wages to start lower and progress slower. They're actually meeting their spouse later, and it turns out, when you get married is a big driver of your lifetime earnings. And so they are earning less than previous generations, and they're spending less. So my hypothesis would be that those thrifty habits they're forming now are great. They just need to catch up on the earning potential. Because remember,
right,
only about 60% of Gen Zers are adults, are old enough to work. And so student loan is scary to Gen Z. They talk about it as a worry. The vast majority of Gen Z hasn't accrued student debt yet, and they, for the last 3 years, haven't had to pay it. So that is about to be a significant new expense for Gen Z, but so far it really hasn't been.
I read an article recently said that once these new student loan payments kick back in, homes can expect an increase of about 5% of the money coming out of the budget. So that's kind of spooky. So what are some of the consequences of younger generations spending less? Who is being affected by all of this?
Yeah, so brands and retailers that cater to those younger consumers, many of those mall-based apparel retailers that tried to entice consumers to buy new garments because of trends, they're finding that the Gen Zer is much more likely to use re-commerce and buy previously owned products. They don't value luxury brands in the same way. Earlier generations cared a lot about sort of a flagship brand and would pay a lot more for that. Gen Z is the social generation, and so they're actually looking for unique stuff. So they're more likely to buy clothes that only they have, that they got from Etsy, than they are from a traditional fashion brand.
Okay, let's talk about the younger generation a bit more, overspending on dining, drinks, travel, and such. And I found it pretty interesting in the story leading into you that a lot of these Gen Zers and others are concerned that maybe some of their friends are steering them down the road to debt, and they are going to avoid that at all costs.
Yeah, so you do have this latent fear. There's more economic uncertainty and concern. But then millennials are really driven. They spend 4 hours a day on social media platforms, and so they're really driven by that sort of online persona that they create. And so you see them, Gen Z in general, spending a lot more on experiences and less on goods. And they take photos of those experiences and put them online on Snapchat and Instagram and now Threads. And so there is a sort of a new hyper competitive version of keeping up with the Joneses that these Gen Zs have to live with. You and I had to look cool in our small circle of friends in high school, but the Gen Zs today have to look cool for their 10,000 followers on Instagram, and it's daunting.
It's not real unless it's on Instagram, right? So what about the fear of missing out and overspending? How big of a drag is this right now?
Yeah, well, the economic data shows that that's more a fear. It shows up in stated preferences. It doesn't show up in observed preferences. Again, at the moment, Gen Z is spending about 40% of the household expenditures that, say, a millennial does, which, the oldest millennials are turning 40 this year. And so they're not overspending. They're actually accruing less debt. They carry way less credit cards than any previous generation. If they do use debt, it's way more likely to be a buy now, pay later or some kind of installment service. And so they're spending on different things. They are spending on the restaurants and the travel and those kinds of things more. But the government data really doesn't jive with what we hear in their stated preferences that they're worried about overspending. The fact that they're worried, I actually take as a healthy sign for the financial habits they're developing.
You know, Jason, your information has been eye-opening for me, and not the least of which is 4 hours a day on social media. We certainly appreciate your time. We'll have you back again and talk about this. This has been great. Thank you so much.
Thanks much. Have a great night.